You've probably heard the word metaphysical and immediately pictured something mystical, maybe something fringy, maybe a little sus. And I get it, because that's exactly the story we've been given. But what if that story was intentional? What if the word metaphysical was never supposed to mean woo? And what if it was just supposed to mean more of being human than you were ever taught to access? In this episode, we look at the word metaphysical. What does it actually mean? How do we know it? And how does it need to evolve in order for us individually and as a collective consider it as a part of us, a part of our human being? My name is Sarah Nickerson, and welcome to Sovereign Humankind, evolving inner authority through metaphysical skill. I'm a psychic medium and founder of nextgenmedium.com and the NextGen Sovereign online metaphysical abilities education center and community space focused on developing human bioperceptual technology, which means intuition, psychic ability, and purpose-led living. Before we begin, if you find what I'm sharing is something you want to support, please consider donating at buymeacoffee.com/nextgenmedium. GEN, gen, like generation. Next Gen Medium, one word. Thank you. And let's begin. When I was 12, 13, 14, in those early teenage years, I remember going to a local chain bookstore and going into the tarot card section. And everything that was in that section, the metaphysical section, had angels and clouds and all kinds of ethereal looking things, very mystical and kind of magical. And so when I hear the word metaphysical, I think of my first impression of those things when I was just a kid. And they're kind of occulty things, or they're things relating to maybe God or religion. And for a lot of people, that section of the store is a section of the store that people are very skeptical of in our society. I'm imagining if you are listening to this, that you're not so skeptical. But when we explore the word metaphysical, we have to understand that absolutely a part of our conditioning of the word metaphysical. And when I was trying to decide on the name of this podcast, the word metaphysical was something that I was really not sure if I should be including in the title, because I didn't want people to not listen to the podcast because the word metaphysical was included in the title. But I felt like I was doing everybody a disservice if I didn't include the word metaphysical, because one of the things I want to change is people's relationship with the word. So I can imagine that people have seen the word in that word in the title of this podcast and just skipped by because they thought, that's some kind of occult guru, weirdo, woo-woo stuff. And I think there's a part of me that would totally understand why someone would skip by that. But at the same time, I talk about metaphysical so much that I don't think I would be sharing authentically. I don't think that's the word. I feel like it would be something I would be holding back from people and then exposing them a lot in this podcast to that word. And maybe people thinking like, I didn't think this podcast was going to be like this, So I feel like if I include the word metaphysical, I feel like I'm telling everybody what's going on here, and I'm not hiding anything. But I still think about how the word is misunderstood and how the bigger points that we're going to be exploring with all these things related to metaphysical and psychic ability and intuition and even higher self, even that word is kind of loaded. That term is kind of loaded. There is a bigger picture issue, which is shared language. And if we don't challenge these words, we don't talk about them, we don't clarify them, then we don't build a common lexicon together. And then we're perpetuating the problem. So that's where we're really beginning this episode. And this being like the real first episode of teaching, I just want to make it clear that I'm not here to convince you of anything to do with metaphysical. Everything I share is something to consider. And everything that I share comes from experience And if there's information that I share that comes from beyond my experience, I will let you know what that is. But I predominantly wanted to create a podcast where I could share how I think people can explore this stuff for themselves from my own experience of not knowing I could do psychic ability and then finding I could. And in that process, being able to recognize that these are skills that I learned. And it took me a year to get to this point to saying psychic is real and that I can do it. And with that, seeing it as a skill, something that could be available to anybody. And so I see this podcast as a lab, as like a philosophical lab, as an audiological classroom. And again, like I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just here to just share and to have you consider. And skepticism is 100% expected. If anything, carry that with you. For a year of exploring my psychic ability, I held skepticism because that was the one thing, that was the truth that was holding me to reality, was it hasn't proven itself yet. It hasn't proven itself yet, which is funny because it's a layered process, truth. We might not quite understand that from our experience, maybe up to this point of our lives and talking about this and what we'll soon be talking about more. But skepticism is absolutely part of the process, and you should never believe anything that anybody else has to say because it is your experience that builds the truth. Truth comes from evidence. It's not just belief. Everybody can believe, but once you have experience that includes evidence, then we're in a different place. Then it's inner authority. Then it's inner sovereignty that is being tapped there. So by the end of this episode, the word metaphysical should feel less like a category you opt into and more like a description of something you already are. It is not external to you. It is of you. So let's go ahead and get started and really get to know the word metaphysical. So let's talk about the word metaphysical. What does it actually mean? And what were we told that it means? Let's break down the actual word metaphysical. Meta means beyond, and physical is like the material world, the physical world. So beyond the physical, even that term, it doesn't necessarily give you the feels of something mystical or magical, but that's certainly where our minds go with the word metaphysical. Nothing in that definition says impossible or spiritual, or for some but not others. So how can we integrate this word as something that's of us within our body? Even think of the term and then thinking about, well, how do I know what's in my head, that there is actually a brain in my head without having seen it? And this is, of course, this is part of where we have our truth come external of us in places that we trust. From school, I learned that I have a brain. From PBS, I learned that my brain is how I think and how I'm able to do things. How I'm able to process and conceptualize and choose, But, the brain is beyond your physical observation. Like I can't see my brain. So there's a lot that actually fits in this definition that we kind of narrow down as to beyond the physical. But when we entertain this word, what we need to really be doing with this word is trying to figure out and bring our attention and awareness to who defined this word? Where does this word come from? What's my experience with this word? And so when we are able to kind of take a step back, go to the dictionary, see metaphysical, see what that means, beyond the physical, how does that already change your definition of the word? And I can think back to being that 12, 13, 14-year-old kid and instantly being in the metaphysical section of the bookstore, fortune tellers and séances and crystals and the occult. And then there's the other aspect that goes along with those kinds of people who like those kinds of things. Those people are naive. Those people aren't very smart. they're gullible people. And maybe the framing of who buys into metaphysical is a trap that people want to avoid before they even get to know what metaphysical actually is and that they themselves take part in metaphysical. And so my reframe for metaphysical is that this is a part of your innate human bioperceptual technology. Talking about the word metaphysical beyond the physical, we are talking about specific skills. In what I share of inner sovereignty skills, inner authority, human sovereignty skills, we talk about psychic ability, which opens up your understanding of truth. We talk about intuition, which opens up your relationship with trust. And we talk about higher self-alignment, which opens you up to understanding choice/freedom. That's a big one. That one is kind of more focused on manifestation. And it was actually, there was a time that I was teaching it as manifestation, but then I realized manifestation was the result of higher self-alignment. So that became higher self-alignment and talking about purpose as well. And that these are all metaphysical abilities. And why are they those things? Because we are using abilities that allow us to see and experience things that aren't physically around us. And that would be the psychic aspect. That is witnessing truth where truth shouldn't be. That's the way that I always say it, because it's so profound when truth shows up where truth shouldn't be. It blows your minds. And that's where I start everybody off with the educational material that I share. Secondly, we are talking about intuition. This is information that is felt in the body. This is where the body really becomes a tool of guiding you on what to do and when to do it and how to do it. This is all information that's gathered from your intuition. So that is another metaphysical skill that we talk about. The third one is higher self-alignment. This has more to do with emotional intelligence, gaining observation and understanding it as information. This is also building the path towards happiness, abundance, all those fun words that we all want to feel, all of the things that we want to have, which is actually a feeling, and to feel it as often as possible. And there is a path, there's a road that gets you there, and there's also the understanding of working purpose. And this you can actually be much more strategic with, and maybe not so much metaphysical, but we also have to take into consideration that emotions are part of your metaphysical messaging, and that you being able to alchemize and transmute is your ability of utilizing your metaphysical abilities. So all three of these things are part of what we're talking about with metaphysical. And in the end, when you're able to put all these things together and have the experiences of these things actually working for you, there's a practical usage. There is reconditioning that takes place. And in that, you're able to embody a more truer sense of your humanity and your inner authority, which is something that we're not used to. And we don't have a lot of people that we can look to that embody that inner authority or that sovereign self-led individual. But that's our work. Our work is to make those people so that people around us know what that looks like and what that feels like. And then they can emulate that as well, because they will naturally be attracted to it, because it is innate. It is our homeostasis place. So when we talk about metaphysical in our sense, we are understanding that this is something that is disconnected from us, something we are looking to rejoin in order to gain a homeostasis human experience. It's the experience we are missing out on, and we have been missing out on for a very long time. Being human also means that what exists of you is beyond the physical as well. And we have proof of this. It's in science. There's even touches of it in religions. These abilities aren't paranormal in the sense of scary or rare. They're just not noticed. We have a culture that is built on suppressing it, which is something I'm going to be chatting about a little bit later in this episode, but it's not absent. And there's actually plenty of ways that we experience touches, sort of the doorways of our metaphysical being or abilities or skills that are there sitting and waiting for us. And so the insight we need to gain with metaphysical is we're so used to the word meaning a detachment of who we are, that it's something beyond you. But your body isn't that. Your body is of beyond the physical self. And once you start exploring your metaphysical abilities, you start exploring it and experiencing it, you realize it's right where you are, and that it's because of you that metaphysical exists. Part of my journey that has me understand metaphysical in a way that I think a lot of people can relate to. Now, you may not have had a psychic dream, right? But I was 12 years old. I had a psychic dream. It happened, like the psychic dream happened 2 days later in like real life. It wasn't until I was 33 that I started exploring metaphysical stuff. I started exploring mediumship specifically, which also included psychic for me in my experience. And I think about that gap from the time I was 12 to the time I was 33 as those abilities were there and they showed themselves. I just didn't know what it looked like or felt like or understood it because it wasn't cultural. It wasn't like, be on the lookout for this. That just isn't ingrained in our growing up or our reality. And so I can honestly say, now I know that I had 20 years of my life where these things were dormant. They would show up and pop up occasionally, but I didn't really know why or what was happening or thinking that I was psychic. But it wasn't until I started exploring these things that it really became defined and known for me and became my truth. And so it's so easy for us to detach the sense of a metaphysical self because for us, there's a lot of that's wrapped around identity and culture that make this something not of our experience. Like some people have it, some people don't. And I think one of the things that we are riding against with accepting metaphysical as something that I can do or something that is of me is the sense of legitimacy of metaphysical. And there's a place that we look to for legitimacy, and it has its hints of telling us that this stuff could be possible, but there's a lot behind it that we need to be looking further into. And what makes it legitimate would be science. So let's look and talk a little bit more about that. So science has something to say about metaphysical. The scientific conversation around consciousness and expanded perception, it's much bigger than maybe we're culturally aware of. And I think we might be in a time, just so you know, I'm recording this in 2026, in March 2026. Maybe I need to be more specific than that. The middle of March 2026. And there has been a lot of lost faith in our institutions, and science is absolutely one of those institutions. The skeptics say science hasn't proven metaphysical abilities. Like let's narrow it down to the abilities that we're talking about, like psychic ability and intuition, right? But that requires us to ask, when has science challenged this? And what was the methodology? And what tools did it use? And who funded it? And I think when we break down the institution of science at this time and how it works, we gotta maybe take into consideration that there's a lot of components that might not be working in our favor of having this stuff be proven true. And when I say in our favor, I'm not talking about my favor or your favor. I'm talking about a institutional favor. But let's just bring it back to science for a second, because science, it's a method. It is not a verdict. And so if we're scientifically blind to psychic ability as innate skill, how are we even going to measure it? You can't put intuition or psychic vision in a beaker. Of course, I have my own scientific investigation ideas that I think could help prove psychic ability or mediumship ability, being able to receive information and people being able to capture that. I think that's possible. But when we look at our institutions proving metaphysical or capturing this as a thing of truth, it's really interesting because some of our institutions have. And one of those institutions is actually the US government, which is really on shaky ground right now when it comes to having trust and faith in an institution and seeing it as something that aligns with you and your sense of ethics and morals and truth. But the US government actually participated in a remote viewing program that ran for 30 years. They ran it for 30 years, spent millions of dollars on it. It was actually something that I found online. And when I was looking through it, this document that became declassified, and you can see it too. I've had it on my Next Gen Medium blog since the inception of my blog because I couldn't believe I found it. I couldn't believe that that was there and that the US government had been on board with remote viewing, which is psychic ability, for 30 years. And the only reason why they were doing it was to compete with the Russians who were doing it too. But there are institutions out there that are trying to do the work of understanding intuition and psychic ability. Heart Math Institute research is one of them. Noetic Institute is another. The Monroe Institute, Oak Bridge Institute. So it's not like there aren't people out there who are trying to do the work, but these are like nonprofit organizations. And I think one of the problems facing science with metaphysical is what counts as metaphysical. But if we were to narrow it down to like psychic ability and intuition, these are things that science has a way to go with trying to figure out just the human body. Being a woman in perimenopause, I have seen the deficiencies of our medical system when it came to seeing the very thing that I had that I was going to have in my lifetime, and nobody noticed it. Nobody was able to pinpoint what my problem was and that it was perimenopause. And just that experience alone, as a woman, going through this thing that just about every woman's going to go through, and to see like our modern medicine, which is attached to our science institutions, completely fail me for years. And it really makes you wonder, like, why are we not further along with this just understanding women's health? For instance, it can't be concluded that I'm in perimenopause. It requires me to basically subject my body to changing my hormone levels. And for any woman that's gone through that, you know, some women might be easier for them, but for me, every time my estrogen level changes, I get migraines, and it sometimes shows up with headaches, but in other ways, it's like I get really depressed. I lose all hope in life, you know, and it's days that I got to go through this. And sometimes it's weeks to recover just from a tiny change in hormone levels. And to think for years and years and years, like I was being depleted of these hormone levels, and the stuff that relies on hormones in your brain just starts disconnecting and shutting down, like memory and cognitive function, brain fog. It's just astounding that I'm going to be 41 in a couple months, and that this stuff is still absolutely, like I am a science experiment. And I have to have a job during all this so I can bring in money to feed my kids and be a mom and be a human being that other people can depend on. And it's been absolutely impossible through this whole process. And to think that I am one woman who's going through this at a younger age, and to think of like all the women that's had to deal with this in the past, I cannot understand why we could put a man on the moon, but you can't tell me what I need, know where I am in my menopause journey, or what I need to supplement in order for me to get my life back together and be able to work without being absolutely terrified that I can even go work and like hold down a job. Unreal to me, the whole process. I'm obviously shooketh here because it's just been abysmal. But to think if science and medicine is struggling with half of the population of the world and how being a woman works, like they still don't get it. They still don't understand it. And if they can't do that, why not? Where are the priorities here? Who's benefiting? And that's where I get kind of, conspiracy here. I honestly don't feel it's conspiracy at this point. I feel like we've seen so many things proven about how we can't trust our institutions. And I think a lot of people would be nodding along with me when I got to say, who's going to fund humans learning they have psychic abilities that are trainable? Who benefits from you being connected to a sense of self where your truth doesn't come from somebody else, not the news, not the government, not a lab? Who benefits from you feeling secure and happy? Not big pharma, not the car companies. I don't think this is conspiracy anymore. I think this is how a capitalistic society perpetually continues. It's sociology, and it's what we know, and it's what we're experiencing. This is where I do get to put in my 2 cents of what we can do to create a science experiment, a method. Add a method to this, where maybe we can get a little bit closer to understanding the truth of our metaphysical abilities. So there is an experiment that's been put on all over the world with various universities that are taking an individual, putting in EEG cap on their head, which reads their brainwaves. And the individual is looking at images on a computer screen. And the information that's coming through in the brainwaves is being fed to a database. And that database is then being fed to AI. And AI is deciphering what that person is seeing. It takes time for the person who is looking at the imagery to train AI, because it's a process where AI has to learn what the person is seeing, and it can read it from brainwaves, but the person has to help narrow down AI to get more specific with the imaging. And it takes a long time. It's not like an instantaneous process. It takes, from what I saw of these results from these universities, like weeks and months to train AI to get accurate with the images that were seen by the individual doing the testing comparatively to what AI was showing what it thinks the person is seeing. And so with time, though, the person training AI can get kind of close to what's going on. I'm sure it's advanced quite a bit since I saw these news stories cycling a couple years ago. The other interesting thing to add into this is that there was another study, and what that study was about was seeing if what you physically saw and see with your eyeballs, if that produces a different brainwave activity than if you were to imagine it in your visual imagination. And the scientific study showed that it didn't matter if you were looking at something with your physical eyeballs or if you were visualizing it in your brain, the brain waves were the same. That's what this study showed. And I think these two pieces of information, both AI being able to show you the imagery that you are seeing, combined with knowing that what we see in our mind's eye can be interpreted as visual information. Putting those two things together, I think, gives us a chance for me being able to sit and do a psychic reading, mediumship reading with somebody, and having a screen behind me where the sitter could see what I'm visually seeing in my mind's eye. They could essentially be seeing the face of their loved one who I am claiming to connect with. But again, what we really need to understand in this process, and I think this is one of the more important things to take away from this episode, is we don't need to wait for institutional permission. And that's why I do what I do. Because what has been a life-changing experience for me was something that I tested, that I gained the evidence in, and that I ultimately had to decide if it was truth or not. And so if there's anything you take away from this whole podcast series, it's not that there's someone that's going to be standing around telling you, oh, you did it. Oh, you got it. That is not at all how this works. There comes a point when you need to decide, have I seen enough? Have I gotten the truth? Am I there yet? And some people will say no, not because they haven't gotten the truth, but because they can't handle that as the truth. So this is like metaphysical's current issue. But what about the past and up to now? Why is it something that's hidden? Something to consider, and I think about a lot because I'm really interested in ancient history and ancient people. I think that stuff's really fascinating to me. I think there's so much to ancient human history that we don't understand, and that there's going to be a point when we uncover how intelligent people really were a long time ago. And I'd like to consider that people of ancient history were more connected to the possibility of these things and essentially to these things as part of their culture than we could ever understand at this point in human history. And to think, if we had this ability, how would this have existed for ancient people? Then why did it change? And why did it change so we don't seem to have it now? The whole point of this concept of talking about metaphysical is for you to understand that it's there. It's always there. It's a part of you. These things are actually a part of our normal human being. So why is it that we're not experiencing these things now? My postulation is that before mass civilizations, these abilities weren't fringe, that they were natural, they were innate, and they were a part of the tribe. Every culture has its medicine person, its oracle, its visionary. There was Egyptian mystery schools, indigenous traditions, Vedic philosophy, early Christian mysticism, Greek oracles. All of this showcased direct perception beyond the senses that were a part of like a developed human capacity and not necessarily a specialty. I always think about, when I think about ancient humans, I think about the possibility of psychic ability and how it's shown up amongst the metaphysical abilities I talk about. And I always think of Buddhist cities. These are like expanded abilities that were a part of Buddhist culture, of spiritual ascension. And these expanded abilities included psychic vision. And I remember coming across this earlier in my exploration and being astounded that this was sort of a normal part of their religious sort of levels of moving up in your monkhood or whatever. And so I look at ancient religious traditions now, and at one point with religion, I really felt like that was something that was like I did not want anything to do with religion. But after my own spiritual awakening and my own exploration with psychic abilities, I started to see spiritual stuff within religious things and saw that there was a merging of the two in there sometimes. And that this is an example of how I connect with something that's religious, when at one time I would have completely discounted the religion, even though Buddhism was more in line with my own personal philosophies. It's still something that's religious and of tradition. And I was really astounded to come across that. But I think it also speaks to an ancient wisdom, an ancient connection that humans had that we cannot have right now. We could try to have, but I don't know if we can really break free from that conditioning. But you got to think that ancient humans, they required expanded perception to track and to make community decisions, to have a felt sense. Like these were things that were practiced and maybe not mystified and were a part of survival. And so my theory continues in that, what is it that makes it so we're not connected to this thing, that it's not a part of our culture, that it's not a tribe thing? And what I really think is the key there is the tribe aspect, is that populations grew, agriculture became a thing, and that allowed for bigger amounts of people to live in an area. And so this created mass civilization. And with that, there had to be a way to control a mass amount of people. And I can speculate that organized religion, centralized power, political power, and institutions were ways to create a submissive mass population and to keep everybody in line and to keep everything moving in order to have the amount of food needed to feed the army, needed to gain more lands, needed to become more powerful, in order to please God, right? Or the gods. what I've recognized of metaphysical abilities through my journey is that they bring about sovereignty. They bring about an inner security that makes you go, I don't need you. I don't need your truth. I don't need your trust. And I don't need you to tell me what my choices are because I know what these things are for me. And that's hard to deal with when you're trying to control people. Also, a part of this journey is moving towards what makes you happy. And if everybody is disconnected from that piece of don't worry about your happiness or don't worry about long-term happiness, like get little bits of happiness, that'll do you, you know? Wrangling all of these things together, you need to control a population of people. And this is where I feel like there was a suppression of these abilities. And we see it in religion. We see it in cultures even today. Metaphysical is still something that is shameful, you know, in our society to some extent. Some people are like, well, I see it as possible. And I don't see why I should feel shame in that. And that's great. But there's still plenty of people out there that will feel that. And I definitely had some of that, even when the truth of psychic ability became proof for me. I still had that sense of, I don't want people to see me as that person, having a shame associated with it that I was scared people would know about. And so we see this suppression through history with religion, witch trials even, that there's this sense of the mystical experience being something to suppress. These are documented throughout history. It's sociological. It's a way of maintaining power and knowledge. And so I bring all this up because I think there is something for us to consider as we're trying to make sense of this as reality, that accepting that there's a disconnection helps us provide the possibility of a reconnection, and that we should consider metaphysical as a missing piece. That's a piece of us owning our inner authority and gaining control of a sovereign self. And then the last piece to talk about is words, language. How does suppression continue to exist? It's how we communicate with each other. I always bring up an example of this aspect of language because there's something that's, I think, is really profound to kind of suss out here when it comes to understanding how important words are. I often think about, with this particular subject, the Inuit and how they have many words for the word ice. It's something that's so central and crucial in their culture, ice. And they have so many words for it. Yet, you go in other places around the world, ice is not that integrated into their society, so much so that it's reflected in the language. So when you start incorporating the skills and you start having experiences of metaphysical abilities, this is where your experience needs to have a word to hold on to in order to try to make sense of what you experience. And this is probably one of the most frustrating things about exploring these things, is the words that are used are mixed up, jumbled up. Sometimes they're not the right words. Sometimes there's a word that you don't know about and you don't come across for a very long time. Or there's words that aren't even there for you to use when it comes to exploring your metaphysical abilities, what you experience, how you experience these things. And so with that, we see that our culture has given us really no words to use, not a lot of lexicon around metaphysical abilities. In some ways, I actually see how much the terminology we do use, and even within metaphysical communities or psychic spiritual communities, we use the same words, but we're using them in different ways and maybe not even realizing that we're using them in different ways. And that is perpetuating the problem that people can't hold on to metaphysical because the words aren't even lining up in the community. And, the bigger issue here is that language shapes permission. That once you control the vocabulary around an experience, you can control whether people will explore it or are they going to not explore it because it's something that they don't identify with, that they don't have enough words about it to know that that's something that's connected with them. Metaphysical became associated with delusion and gullibility, the uneducated, and that story does more to suppress exploration than any law ever could, because what we're really talking about is, what will other people think of me? That is absolutely a part of my story. There was a point when I wanted to explore this by doing readings with people, and I put together a Facebook post to send out to all my friends and family and past coworkers, and I was hesitant to press publish. I sat on it for a while, and it wasn't until like one brave, courageous moment that I went ahead and pushed publish. And there was one person I had in my brain that I was kind of terrified of, that person knowing this about me, knowing that I could be considering this. And I'm glad I pressed publish, because it was one of those readings that changed my whole idea and understanding of the truth and reality that you and me share. So the last little piece to this puzzle that I feel like that helps us understand, why is this not, like, why would we not know we have psychic abilities or mediumship abilities, is that the language, the very language we use, the subjects we talk about or don't talk about, it's what opens the door to possibility. And if we don't have language around mediumship, psychic ability, intuition, metaphysical abilities as something that is possible, that's a gateway for you to walk through, we don't have that as part of our language and the coloring and the concepts of our culture, then people don't know this is a part of their reality or that this is available to them. And so I think this goes on sort of an internal level of us practicing metaphysical abilities, that we are responsible for creating a language and a lexicon that works amongst us, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to put this podcast together, was to set something straight on how I view the things, so that when we talk about the things, we're on the same page with what I'm talking about. So reclaiming language. This is how we can reclaim the territory. Of course, being able to do that through the words that we use, the concepts we can bring into place, but also, what got us here. That is absolutely a part of the conversation. So here's what we've actually been talking about today. The word metaphysical. It describes real, innate human perception that extends beyond our trained, conditioned default. Science can't fully measure it yet, but it hasn't disproven it. Ancient humans maybe treated it as normal. And the reason it doesn't feel normal to us, I don't think is random. I think it's on purpose. And it's the result of a very long, very deliberate process of disconnection that ran through religion and politics and institutions of school and law, and most broadly, the language we share. We didn't lose these abilities. We were conditioned to stop noticing them and stop trusting them. And parts of how we connect with these abilities have dysfunction to them, and that's how we can't trust them. Metaphysical, beyond the physical. You are beyond the physical. Being human is beyond the physical. And if we know that there is dysfunction, which we will learn more about in this podcast series, this helps us get closer to working through the dysfunction to create function. And that's a different problem, but at least that's a problem we can solve. And here's the big thing I get to leave you with. It's thinking of the word metaphysical, beyond the self, beyond the physical. One of the things that I set you up with, that I will in this series, and that will be integral to your psychic exploration, is your imagination. And if you have used your imagination, this is part of the toolkit of connecting with your metaphysical abilities. And if you have imagery that comes through, either you go in to get the imagery or the imagery just happens, that might be psychic, by the way. This is you already accessing your beyond the physical abilities, your metaphysical abilities. And if you've had that experience, you have already connected with a piece of you that before this episode, you might not have known was a part of you. And now I get to leave you with that. Hey, You already did it. See? It was always there. You just didn't know what it looked like. You didn't know because nobody told you what it's like. This is what this series is all about. Metaphysical. It's not outside of you. It is you. It might not be realized, but if you can consider that psychic ability could be dormant for you, like it was for me. Because remember, I told you I was 12 years old when I had a psychic dream. And after that, I didn't consider that I was psychic until I was 33 and exploring. And it took me a year. And eventually it became my truth. It was dormant all that time. And we are already getting you closer to the truth, getting you closer to understanding truth, understanding trust, and gaining a better relationship with choice because it's innately inherited and it's ready to get going. And that does it for this episode of Sovereign Humankind. Next episode, we'll be diving into perception, designing sovereign perception, building our sight, our window to realities. And if your curiosity feels ignited right now, that's not nothing. That's your inner authority saying, I've been waiting for this. That's the beacon. Follow that to nextgenmedium.com. And the Next Gen Sovereign Foundations level is where the exploration begins, with a 21-day challenge to start experiencing your world anew. And you can also support this podcast if you felt like this information meant something to you by donating at buymeacoffee.com/nextgenmedium. This is Sarah Nickerson of Next Gen Medium and the Next Gen Sovereign community. Be well, take care, and get to observing.